The schoolhouse boards creaked in the wind, warped from years of dust storms that rolled through Red Bluff like clockwork. Inside, Margaret Hale stood at the slate, erasing the day's arithmetic while evening light slanted through gaps in the walls. Her dress was mended at the elbows. Her hands were chalk-stained and rough from work that never ended. Outside on the wooden steps, her 2 younger brothers waited. Thomas was 9, his boots split at the seams. William was 7, wearing a coat that had belonged to Thomas 2 winters ago. They sat quiet, the way children got when they learned early that complaints changed nothing. Their mother had died giving birth to a stillborn sister. Their father had signed on to a cattle drive that spring, heading north with promises of pay that would see them through the year. The drive never came back. No cattle. No men. Just silence that stretched into months, then into acceptance. Margaret was 18 when the county made her their guardian. She was 19 now, teaching children their letters for a wage that bought flour and little else. The town was dying the way frontier towns died when the world moved on. The railroad had shifted its line south, chasing flatter ground and cheaper routes. Freight stopped coming. Stores that once extended credit now asked for coins up front, and their shelves grew barer each month. She reached into her pocket and felt the folded paper there. A notice from the county clerk. Official ink on cheap paper. It said that unless she could prove steady income and suitable living conditions by the end of winter, her brothers would be removed from her care. Separate homes. Separate counties. They would grow up apart, forgetting each other's faces the way children forgot things they could not hold on to. Margaret had read that notice a dozen times, searching for a way around words that allowed no room for argument. There was none. The law was clear, and the law did not care that she loved them. Red Bluff had maybe 200 people left, and most were planning their own departures. The hotel had closed. The marshal had moved on. Even the church held services only twice a month now, when the circuit preacher made his rounds. That was when Samuel Crow arrived. He came at dusk on a Thursday, driving a mule team hitched to a freight wagon that looked held together by hope and repair work. The wagon bed was long and patched in a dozen places, but the wheels were sound and the cargo was lashed tight. He paid the stable keeper in exact coins, spoke only to confirm the rate, and slept on the ground beside his rig instead of paying for a room. His clothes were worn but clean. His face was weathered, hard to age. 30, maybe. Maybe older. His hands were scarred the way hands got from years of rope work and iron tools, not from the kind of fighting men did in saloons over cards and pride. People noticed him because strangers were rare now, and because he did not behave like men passing through. He did not drink. He did not ask questions. He bought supplies, checked his rig, and kept to himself with the kind of quiet that made folks uneasy. Someone told Margaret he hauled freight beyond the rail lines, into places the maps called territories but did not bother naming. Salt and seed and lamp oil. Mail that would never arrive otherwise. He went where the railroad did not, serving towns even smaller and more forgotten than Red Bluff. Someone else said he avoided settlements because towns had a way of asking questions, and men like him preferred not to answer. Margaret listened but did not think much of it. She had her own troubles, and a stranger's business was not among them. Not yet. Samuel came to the schoolhouse on his 3rd evening in town. Margaret was sweeping the floor while her brothers copied their letters at a corner desk. The light was failing, and she was about to send them home when his shadow filled the doorway. He held a paper in one hand, folded and creased from travel. He asked if she could read a bill of lading for him. His voice was low and even, the kind that did not waste words. Margaret sent her brothers outside to wait. She took the paper and read it by lamplight. It was a freight manifest, listing goods and weights and destinations she had never heard of. Some of the writing was poor, the terms unclear. She explained what she could, translating the shorthand and the misspellings into plain sense. Samuel listened without interrupting. When she finished, he nodded once and thanked her. He folded the paper and turned to leave. Then he stopped at the threshold and turned back. He said he needed a wife. Margaret stared at him, unsure if she had heard correctly. He did not smile or soften the statement. He said it the way a man might say he needed a new axle or a sound horse. A matter of fact, not feeling. He continued before she could respond. He did not need a wife for comfort or companionship, he said. He needed someone for standing. Someone who could read and write, keep accounts, handle correspondence with storekeepers and suppliers. Someone who could mind a home that moved as often as it stayed put. He offered marriage. He offered steady provision for her and her brothers. He offered a life away from Red Bluff, away from county clerks and their notices, away from places where the law could separate families because poverty was not a good enough reason to stay together. No romance, he said. No promises he could not keep. Just work and survival and a chance to stay ahead of the kind of trouble that came from staying in one place too long. Margaret felt the weight of the notice in her pocket. She looked past him to where her brothers sat on the steps, their thin shapes outlined against the dusk. She thought of winter coming, of the clerk's deadline, of the separate homes waiting to swallow them whole. She told Samuel she needed time to think. He nodded and left without another word. That night, Margaret lay awake in the rented room she shared with her brothers. They slept curled together for warmth under blankets too thin for the season ahead. She listened to their breathing and counted the coins in the jar she kept hidden beneath the floorboards. $11. Maybe enough for a month, if she stretched it. She took out the county notice and read it again by the stub of a candle. The words had not changed. The deadline had not moved. The law would do what the law did, indifferent and thorough. At dawn, she found Samuel hitching his mule team in front of the stable. Frost clung to the wagon boards. His breath misted in the cold air. She told him yes. He asked if she was certain. She said she was. He asked if her brothers could be ready by noon. She said they could. They married in the back room of the general store 2 hours later. The owner served as witness, signing his name in a ledger that would likely never be reviewed by anyone who mattered. There were no flowers, no gathered friends, no vows beyond the ones required by custom. By noon, Margaret and her brothers had packed what little they owned into a single trunk. The town watched them leave from doorways and windows, but no one said goodbye. Red Bluff fell behind them in dust and distance, and the world widened into something unknown. Samuel said little as the land opened before them. The mule team pulled steady, and the wagon rolled over ruts that had once been roads. Margaret sat beside him on the driver's bench, her brothers in the wagon bed among sacks of flour and crates of tinned goods. The town disappeared behind a rise, and then there was only prairie and sky. Telegraph poles lined the route for the first day, their wires humming faintly in the wind. By the second day, the poles grew sparse. By the third, they vanished entirely. The roads narrowed from wagon tracks to trails, then to paths that Samuel seemed to follow by instinct rather than markings. They slept under canvas stretched between the wagon and stakes driven into hard ground. Samuel cooked plain food over small fires, beans and bacon, cornmeal stirred into boiling water, coffee strong enough to taste like punishment. He worked with the efficiency of a man who had done these tasks 1,000 times and saw no reason to vary them. Margaret learned quickly to stay quiet and watch. She noticed how Samuel studied the sky each evening, reading clouds for rain or wind. She saw how he chose campsites near water but never directly beside it, always uphill in case of flooding. He checked the mules' hooves every night and rationed their feed with careful attention. Her brothers adapted faster than she expected. Thomas helped unhitch the team without being asked. William gathered kindling and kept the water barrel filled from whatever creek or spring they stopped near. They asked a few questions, sensing that Samuel was not a man who wasted breath on unnecessary conversation. After a week on the trail, Margaret began to notice things that did not fit the picture of a struggling freight hauler. Riders appeared at crossings where no town stood, emerging from the landscape as if they had been waiting. They tipped their hats to Samuel and exchanged a few words before moving on. They never asked for payment or explained their presence. At a lonely trading post built from sod and salvaged lumber, the storekeeper filled Samuel's order without checking his credit or asking for coins up front. He simply loaded the goods and marked figures in a ledger, nodding as Samuel drove away. At a river ford where the current ran swift and muddy, 3 other wagons waited on the bank. Their drivers stood in a loose group, talking among themselves. When Samuel arrived, they fell quiet. He studied the water for a long moment, then nodded. The first wagon rolled forward, and the others followed in turn. No one questioned the order. No one argued priority. 2 days later, a dispute broke out at a crossroads where 2 freight outfits met coming from opposite directions. The trail was narrow, hemmed by rock on one side and a steep drop on the other. Neither driver wanted to back up half a mile to let the other pass. Voices rose. Hands moved toward belts where pistols hung. Samuel climbed down from his wagon and walked between them. He spoke quietly, too low for Margaret to hear. He pulled a small leather ledger from his coat and showed them something written inside. Both drivers looked, read, and nodded. One backed his team without further complaint. Margaret said nothing, but she filed the moment away with the others. On the 10th day, they climbed into high country where the air thinned and the horizon stretched in all directions. The trail crested a ridge, and Samuel pulled the team to a halt. Below them lay a basin cupped between hills. Wagons stood in organized lines like animals at a watering hole. A long shed roofed with tin reflected sunlight. Smaller structures dotted the area, tents, lean-tos, a corral holding horses and mules. Smoke rose from cook fires. People moved with purpose between the wagons and the shed. Samuel set the brake and looked at Margaret. "This is the hub," he said. The basin was larger than it had appeared from the ridge. 3 main routes converged here, worn into the earth by years of wheels and hooves. Samuel pointed them out as the wagon descended, north to mining camps in the mountains, west toward ranch country that stretched to the territories, south to a border town that fed half the desert settlements beyond. Men and women moved between the wagons with the organized rhythm of people who knew their work. Freight was being sorted, weighed, and redistributed according to destinations Margaret could not guess. Children ran between the adults, some near her brother's ages. A woman stood at the shed's entrance with a clipboard, marking figures as drivers reported their loads. Samuel guided the wagon to an open space and set the brake. Before Margaret could ask questions, a man approached, older, with a beard gone mostly gray and a limp that favored his left leg. "Samuel," the man said, nodding. "Didn't expect you back this soon." "Had business in Red Bluff," Samuel said. He gestured toward Margaret. "This is my wife, Margaret." Her brothers, Thomas and William. The man's eyebrows rose slightly, but he recovered quickly and touched the brim of his hat. "Ma'am. Name's Porter. I manage the shed inventory." He glanced at Samuel. "Wife, you said?" "Married legally," Samuel replied. "She'll be handling correspondence and accounts going forward." Porter nodded slowly, processing this information. "Well then. Welcome to the hub, ma'am. Boys." He turned back to Samuel. "We've got 3 outfits waiting on salt. The northern route's clear, but there's early snow expected in the passes by week's end." Samuel nodded and began discussing loads and timing. Margaret climbed down from the wagon, her brothers following. She watched the basin with growing understanding. This was not a camp. This was a system. Wagons did not arrive randomly. They came in rotation, their schedules coordinated to avoid bottlenecks. The shed held supplies stacked with careful labels: salt, seed, lamp oil, flour, tinned goods, tools, fabric. Everything a settlement beyond the rail lines might need to survive. Over the next few days, Margaret watched and learned. Samuel did not own land in the way towns measured ownership. He owned something more valuable: he controlled movement. He knew which routes stayed passable in winter, where water could be found in dry months, which settlements needed what supplies and when. Other freight haulers deferred to him not out of fear but out of recognition. He had been doing this longer. He had mapped the routes when others were still following railroad timetables. When the rail lines shifted and left whole regions isolated, Samuel had filled the gap. He set rules that everyone followed. Fair weight, fair price. No guns at route meetings. Disputes settled by ledger and reason, not violence. When two haulers claimed the same delivery contract, Samuel checked his records and determined who had taken that route last, then assigned it to the other. No one argued. Margaret saw families who depended on this network. A woman waiting for medicine her husband had requested 3 weeks earlier. A settlement representative collecting seed for spring planting, already paid for through a system of credits Samuel tracked in his ledgers. A storekeeper from a town 2 weeks' travel south, restocking goods that would keep his customers fed through winter. If Samuel stopped, people went hungry. If he chose, entire settlements could be cut off. Towns lived or died based on whether freight reached them. He had built this quietly, without fanfare or official recognition. He answered to no railroad company, no territorial governor, no federal authority. Out here, beyond the telegraph lines and the law's easy reach, Samuel's word carried more weight than any judge's ruling. That night, after her brothers had fallen asleep in the tent Samuel's men had erected for them, he told her the rest. They sat by a fire outside the main camp, far enough for privacy but close enough to see the wagons and the night watch moving between them. Samuel poured coffee into 2 tin cups and handed one to Margaret. The liquid was hot and bitter, the same as he made on the trail. He told her how it started. When the railroad rerouted south, the old freight roads dried up. Towns that depended on regular deliveries found themselves cut off. Families went without flour, medicine, and lamp oil. Some settlements emptied out. Others held on, desperate. Samuel had been hauling freight for years before that, working for companies that folded when the routes changed. He knew the territory. He knew where creeks ran year-round and where they vanished by August. He knew which passes closed first in winter and which stayed open longest. Knowledge other men did not have, because they had never needed it. He started hauling to the forgotten places. Small loads at first, whatever he could carry. But word spread the way it does in empty countries. If you needed something and the railroad would not bring it, Samuel Crow would. For a fair price, paid in cash or trade or credit, he tracked in his ledgers. Others followed his example. Freight haulers who saw opportunity where the railroad saw none. But the routes were hard, the distances brutal, and the weather unforgiving. Men made mistakes. They overloaded wagons, chose bad paths, arrived too late or not at all. Samuel started setting standards. Maximum weights for different terrain. Seasonal schedules. Shared information about trail conditions. When disputes arose over who had rights to a route or a contract, he mediated. His ledgers became the record everyone trusted because he had no reason to lie. He made his living whether the freight moved or not, but the system only worked if it worked for everyone. I didn't set out to run things, Samuel said, staring into the fire. Just tried to keep the wheels turning. People started asking my opinion. Then they started waiting for my decisions. By the time I realized what I'd built, I was already responsible for it. Margaret sipped her coffee and said nothing, letting him continue. I didn't lie to you, he said. But I didn't lead with it either. Told you I needed a wife for standing, and that's true. Out here, a married man looks more settled. County officials, territorial clerks, they take you more seriously if you've got family. Makes you look like you're planning to stay, not just passing through. He glanced at her. And I needed someone who could read and write better than I can. Someone who could keep proper books, write letters that don't sound like a mule Skinner wrote them. Someone who could talk to storekeepers and settlement representatives without making them nervous. Margaret set down her cup. You're telling me this now because trouble's coming. Samuel nodded slowly. Always does. Built something this size, someone's going to want it. The railroad might not care about these routes, but there's men in the cities who see money in controlling supply lines. They'll come eventually. Maybe with contracts, maybe with lawyers, maybe with hired guns. When they do, they'll look for ways to break what we've built here. And a marriage that looks rushed, with no proper filings or witnesses beyond a storekeeper, gives them leverage, Margaret said. Yes. She looked across the basin, at the wagons and tents and the shed where supplies waited to be distributed to places that would starve without them. She thought of her brothers, asleep in a tent among other children whose families depended on this network. Safe, fed, warm. I chose this, she said. Whatever comes, I chose it. Samuel nodded. Fair enough. They sat in silence, drinking bitter coffee while the fire burned low and the stars wheeled overhead. Trouble arrived before the month ended. 3 men rode into the basin on horses too fine for freight work, wearing coats cut from city cloth that had never seen trail dust until now. They carried saddlebags stamped with the seal of a territorial development company Margaret did not recognize. Their boots were polished. Their hats were new. They asked for Samuel Crow, and when he stepped forward, they introduced themselves with titles that meant nothing out here. Land agent. Commercial representative. Legal consultant. They spoke the language of boardrooms and courthouses, formal and practiced. They had papers. Contracts signed by territorial officials granting exclusive freight rights along certain routes. Surveys claiming ownership of water sources and grazing lands within the basin. Documents establishing their company's authority to regulate commercial traffic in unincorporated regions. Samuel listened without expression. When they finished, he asked to see the papers. He read them slowly, his scarred fingers tracing the lines of legal text. Then he handed them back. These routes existed before your company was founded, he said. Water rights belong to whoever maintains the wells and springs. And this basin sits on open territory with no filed claims. The lead man, the one who had introduced himself as the legal consultant, smiled thinly. The territorial legislature has empowered us to organize commerce in regions beyond railroad service. We're not here to shut down your operation, Mr. Crow. We're here to formalize it. Bring it under proper management. Your management, Samuel said. Professional management. With backing from investors who can provide capital, insurance, legal protection. Surely you see the benefit of operating under established authority rather than. He gestured vaguely at the basin. Whatever arrangement you've cobbled together here. Samuel's expression did not change. We move freight. People get what they need. The system works. For now, the consultant said. But what happens when there's a dispute your ledgers can't settle? When someone gets hurt and there's no legal framework to address it? When winter closes the routes and people go without because there's no capital reserve to cover shortages? The questions were reasonable, delivered with the calm confidence of men who had refined these arguments in meetings far from here. They offered money, payment for Samuel's existing routes and goodwill. They offered protection under their company's legal standing. They offered positions within their organization for experienced haulers who agreed to their terms. Samuel refused without raising his voice. He said the system worked because the people in it had a stake in keeping it working. Outside management would optimize for profit, not survival. Within a year, rates would rise and service would decline. He had seen it happen with the railroads. The men exchanged glances. The consultant's smile thinned further. We hoped you'd be reasonable, Mr. Crow. We'd hate for this to become adversarial. Then they turned to Margaret. She had been standing near the shed with Porter, observing. The consultant approached with the same measured courtesy he had shown Samuel. "Mrs. Crow," he said. "You're a schoolteacher, I understand. An educated woman. Surely you see the value of proper order and legitimate authority." Margaret said nothing. "Your marriage," the consultant continued, his tone regretful, "was conducted with minimal formality. No territorial filing, no proper witnesses beyond a storekeeper in a dying town. If challenged in court, its validity could be questioned. Which would affect your standing here. And your brother's situation." The threat was delivered gently, wrapped in concern. "We're not unreasonable people," he continued. "You could return east with your brothers, fully provided for. Our company would ensure they receive proper schooling and care. You'd be free of this hardship. And men with actual experience in commercial logistics could run these routes properly." He waited, expecting her to see reason. Margaret looked past him to the basin, to the families and children and freight haulers who depended on what Samuel had built. "I'd like to see your ledgers," she said. The consultant hesitated, then laughed, a short, dismissive sound. "Our ledgers are proprietary business records, Mrs. Crow. I'm afraid we can't simply." "You're asking us to trust your management," Margaret said. "Show me how you manage." The two other men exchanged glances. The consultant's smile remained fixed, but something shifted behind his eyes. He was accustomed to negotiating with men who thought in terms of territory and force, not women who asked for numbers. "If it would ease your concerns," he said finally, clearly expecting the ledgers to prove his point. He retrieved a leather portfolio from his saddlebag and handed it over. Margaret carried it to the shed where the lamplight was stronger. Samuel followed, along with Porter and several other haulers who had gathered when the strangers arrived. Margaret spread the documents across a rough table. The ledgers were professionally bound, the entries written in neat script. She read through columns of figures while the basin waited. The numbers told their story clearly. The company bought goods at established prices, then marked them up significantly for frontier delivery. Reasonable, perhaps, given the distance and difficulty. But then she found the clauses about route priority fees, seasonal surcharges, and penalties for delayed payment that compounded weekly. She traced the supply chain backwards. A bag of seed that sold for $2 in the city cost $4 at the company's distribution point, then $6 for delivery to a remote settlement. If payment was delayed even a week, penalties pushed the price to $7. By the time a farmer actually planted that seed, he was paying more than 3 times the original cost. She found records of shortages, deliberate ones. Routes delayed to create demand, then supplied at premium rates. Wells that could have been maintained but weren't, forcing haulers to take longer routes through company-controlled stations. Settlements charged for services they had previously managed themselves. Margaret worked through the night. Thomas and William brought her coffee that Porter had made. The men from the city waited, first with amusement, then with growing unease as the hours passed and she continued reading. By morning, she had filled 3 pages with notes in her own hand. She had Porter gather the haulers and settlement representatives who were in the basin. Word spread quickly. People came from tents and wagons, forming a loose crowd around the shed. Margaret stood before them, tired but steady. She spoke without anger, presenting the numbers as facts that needed no embellishment. She explained how the company's system worked. How squeezing profit from one route created shortages elsewhere. How charging premium rates for seed meant settlers couldn't afford enough for a full planting, which meant smaller harvests, which meant less trade goods to pay for next year's seed. A cycle that benefited no one except distant investors who never saw the land or the people. She showed how delays caused by route priority fees, where those who paid more got served first, meant medicine arrived too late, lamp oil ran out before winter ended, flour spoiled because it sat waiting while more profitable freight moved ahead of it. Then she proposed something different. A system already half-built in Samuel's ledgers, but never formalized. Rotating priority based on need rather than payment. Posted rates that everyone could see and verify. Shared maintenance of wells, bridges, and key campsites, with costs distributed among those who used them. A council drawn from drivers, settlers, and storekeepers who actually lived in the territory, people who understood that survival mattered more than quarterly profits. The basin listened in silence. When she finished, she looked at the men from the city. Your system optimizes for extraction. Ours would optimize for endurance. Out here, endurance is what keeps people alive. The consultant opened his mouth to respond. But when he looked at the faces around him, haulers, families, settlement representatives, he found no support. The room stayed quiet. The men from the city left the next morning. They took their papers, their contracts, and their wounded pride. The legal consultant made vague references to judges and territorial authorities, but his voice lacked conviction. Out here, beyond the reach of telegraph lines and courtrooms that took weeks to access, their leverage dissolved like morning frost. Samuel watched them ride out, then returned to the work of organizing freight runs. He spoke no differently than before, gave no speech about victory or vindication. The system continued because the system had to continue. But Margaret noticed the change in how people looked at her. Haulers nodded when she passed. Women at the camp asked her opinion on supply requests. Porters started bringing her the shed's inventory records each evening, waiting while she reviewed the numbers and suggested adjustments. She had not sought authority. She had simply used the skills she possessed, reading, mathematics, clear explanation, and applied them to problems that needed solving. In a West built loud by men with guns and grand claims, she had proven that quiet competence carried its own kind of power. Within a week, she began writing down the rules they had discussed. Not laws, exactly, but agreements. Standards for fair weight and honest measure. Schedules for route rotation during lean seasons. Protocols for maintaining shared resources like wells and river crossings. She wrote in plain language, avoiding the legal terminology that obscured more than it clarified. Samuel's men built a small cabin near the basin center, 2 rooms, a stone fireplace, walls chinked against winter wind. Her brothers attended a camp school that several families maintained, taught by a widow from one of the mining settlements who had been a teacher before her husband died in a shaft collapse. Thomas and William thrived among other children, their faces filling out as regular meals became routine rather than hope. Margaret taught during the day when she could, helping with the school and working with children whose education had been interrupted by migration and hardship. At night, she kept the basin's accounts, tracking freight movements and supply levels with the same care she had once applied to teaching multiplication tables. Samuel hauled as he always had, enforcing the quiet law he had built through years of consistent fairness. But now he had her words to back his decisions, written records that could be referenced, agreements that could be shown to skeptical haulers or settlement representatives who questioned why things were done a certain way. Routes held through the winter. Snow came early to the northern passes, but they had prepared for it, staging supplies at key points before the drifts made travel impossible. Prices remained steady even when shortages could have justified increases. Families stayed together. The territorial government eventually sent an official to investigate reports of unauthorized commerce. He arrived expecting to find chaos or corruption, something that justified intervention. Instead he found ledgers more organized than most county offices, a system of resource distribution that functioned better than anything the territory had implemented, and people who spoke of Samuel and Margaret Crow with respect rather than fear. He filed a report recommending the territory leave well enough alone. Margaret had married Samuel to protect her brothers. She had accepted his proposal because she had no better choice, because the law would have torn her family apart, because sometimes survival required compromises with strangers. She stayed because she chose to. Because the work mattered. Because the man she had married out of necessity had proven to be someone she could respect, even trust. Because out here, beyond the edges of mapped civilization, they were building something that lasted not through force but through fairness. In a West that celebrated gunfighters and outlaws, they proved another story was possible. Quieter. Harder. True. The freight routes endured. The families endured. Margaret Hale Crow, schoolteacher turned keeper of accounts, endured with them. In a land built on legends of gunfighters, Margaret Crow chose a different path. If her story touched you, let us know in the comments, and subscribe for more forgotten tales from the frontier. Thanks for listening.